Hello and welcome to my video on risk appetite. My name is Aaron Hughes and I've been working in the field of enterprise risk management and business continuity for about 6 years across a range of different roles such as risk managing, risk and assurance business partnering and also consultancy. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about what actually is risk appetite. I'll then be talking about the different elements and what's involved with risk appetite to do with risk appetite, tolerance and capacity. I'll then be looking at the different risk appetite levels that we can use and then applying risk appetite to the different themes or categories that we have across risk management and enterprise risk management. I'll then be looking at how risk appetite works with risk scoring, and this really will make risk appetite more practical and usable for your risk in your organization. And then I'll be looking at what is risk appetite actually used for across your organization, and then generally the benefits of having risk appetite. So, what is risk appetite? So, I've got four different definitions here, all from slightly different sources. The first one is from the Institute of Risk Management. The second one is from the ISO, International Standards Organization. The third one here is from the Orange Book, HM Treasury Orange Book. And the third one is from the CIIA. So I'll go through each of these, and I've highlighted some common or important words I think we can look at across each of these. There is different definitions because lots of things in enterprise risk management is subjective. So what we need to do is we need to work through each different opinion to kind of come to our own consensus view in our own organizations or align specifically to one of these. So I'll read them out and we can see where we get to. So the first one from the ERM is the amount of risk that an organization is willing to seek or accept in pursuit of its long-term objectives. Okay, so highlighted amount and accept in this one. The second one is the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to pursue or retain. This is the one I tend to kind of lean towards for a lot of the work that I do. The third one is the amount of risk that an organization is prepared to accept, tolerate, or be exposed to at any point in time. The third one, the level of risk that is acceptable. So this seems to be a very common word. The level of risk that is acceptable to the board or management. This may be set in relation to the organization as a whole for different groups of risks or at an individual risk level. So some of the common words I've identified are kind of the amount of risks that organizations want to take in order to the amount of risks that an organization is willing to accept or pursue in order to kind of reach its long-term objectives. So I tend to lean towards this one here because I quite like it. So the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to pursue, is kind of to go for, or in order to retain or accept. So which one you align to is up to you. But as long as your definition kind of works across these kind of common words and you have a shared understanding and acceptance and consensus view in your organization, that's absolutely fine. But in a general sense, it's how much risk is your organization comfortable with taking in pursuit of its strategy or its objectives. So, when it comes to risk appetite, there are kind of three areas you need to consider because it's not just risk appetite. When it comes to risk management, you've got your risk appetite, which is your area of comfort. So, any risk or risk scoring that falls within this zone, you are comfortable with in your organization. However, you can tolerate a little bit more risk in your organization. I'll give you an example in a minute. And then we've got the third line, which is your risk capacity. So this is the most risk that you can take in your organization before something breaks. So for example, with your risk appetite, if you think about this as a ruler, so if you have a ruler that's straight, if you bend it slightly, just so you're comfortable, that would be your risk appetite. If you bend it a little bit further, but actually you can probably just tolerate it, and then you bend it all the way and it just snaps, that would be your risk capacity. So I'll go through an example to kind of make this make sense. So in this example, I said for comfort, so within your area of risk appetite, a call center has a risk appetite that allows for up to 10% of its position to be vacant at any point in time because they need to take the calls. So with a staff of 200, this means they're comfortable with having around 20 vacancies. Okay, so they're kind of comfortable with that level of risk. Where it gets uncomfortable would be the call center's tolerance is up to 12% or 24% of unfilled positions. But anything beyond that, we're really getting to breaking point now, where it could be the capacity would be 15% or 30. So this might mean that actually they may not be able to keep the call center running. It may not actually be able to work. They might have to close it down at that point. So that would be breaking point in your organization. So for all of your risks or risk category areas, you'll have an area of comfort, an area where you will be uncomfortable, your tolerance, and then your breaking point, which is known as your capacity. So when it comes to our risk appetite areas, there are five different kind of levels we can set for our risk appetite. From averse, and averse would be avoidance of the risk or uncertainty as a key objective. So this is where you really want to avoid risk as much as possible. You want to put lots of controls in to bring your risk down as far as you can, all the way down to bold, and this would be where you'd be eager to choose innovation, or you'd want to take risks in this area for high risk, potentially high reward, and then you've got minimalist, cautious, and open in between. So averse is you want to take or accept the minimal amount of risk as possible. Whereas bold would mean you're comfortable taking lots more risk in order for there to be potential high reward. So an example of this would be potentially a project or a certain investment you might take. So because there's a high reward, you're happy to take more risk. But an averse a category area might be something like your reputation. You may not want to risk much of your reputation as an organization, so you might be averse to taking reputational damage or risks, but you might be more open or bold for innovation or funding or something like that, projects and programs, and then everything in between. So you've got your risk appetite theme. So as I mentioned before, what you basically do, and we mentioned this on previous presentations, is you have your risk category areas. So what you would do is you would align different risk category areas to different risk appetite levels. So you'd map your categories, for example, finance, people, project, reputation, legal and regulatory, operations and strategy. If these were your risk category areas, you could assign a risk appetite level to this particular category of risk. So, what we're eventually saying here, and I mentioned this before, is that for projects, we are happy to take more risk in this area because there could be more reward. However, when it comes to reputation and legal and regulatory risks, we want to avoid these risks as much as possible, or we want to minimize them in terms of their likelihood and impact as much as we possibly can to make them more comfortable. Whereas people, we're happy to be a little bit more in the middle, and operations as well for those ones. So that's what we do for our different risk appetite themes. We assign one of these appetite levels that I showed you on this slide here. Because obviously, averse is the lowest level of risk that you can have, and then bold is you're more comfortable taking more risk. So you assign one of these levels to each of your risk categories that we discussed in a previous presentation. So how does risk appetite actually work when it comes to these levels? So you've seen this 5x5 matrix before, and I've explained what it is. So obviously this is where you plot your likelihood and your impact of your risk. So what you would then essentially do is you would overlay your risk appetite levels, and you can see the colors correspond to the one on the previous slide. So bold would be up here, open would be the green line, cautious, and I think you probably, so cautious would be this yellow line here. Minimalist would be the orange line here, and averse would be this red line here. So you can overlay your risk appetite onto your risk scoring matrix so you know whether your risks are inside or outside of appetite. So let's say we have our project risks here, because don't forget, let's say we've picked our project. So project risks, in order for them to be within appetite, we're using our bold line. So that's the blue one here. So if I go back, so we know if we have any project risks that are above this line, so they're scored 20 or above, this would mean that they are outside of risk appetite. However, if they score below this blue line, so say score 16 and below, we know that any project risk below this blue line is inside of appetite, whether it's at score 1 or at score 16, they are below this blue line, so they are within appetite. Let's use another example. So let's say we're looking at operations risk and they're minimalist, which is the orangey line. So we know that our minimalist line here is this orange one here. So any operations risks that are below this line, so say score 4 or below, they are within appetite. They are within our area of comfort. However, if one of the risks is over the line on our scoring matrix, then they are outside of appetite. So they are beyond the level of comfort for our organization that we've agreed. Let's use another example. So reputation, so averse. And you can see here that obviously the lower the score, the higher, the kind of more averse you are to risk. So with our reputation risk appetite, we use a red line because we picked the averse risk appetite. We want to take as little risk as possible. So any risk below this red line, so score 2 or 1, they are within appetite. You're comfortable with them. However, any score above that, whether it's a 3 or a 25, they're above this red line, so they are therefore outside of your risk appetite. So essentially in your organization, you need to decide where you draw these lines on your risk scoring matrix. So I've used this as an example. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to draw the lines in the same place. You could draw this orange line so it goes up there if you wanted to, but you need to come to an area where you have a consensus, an agreement as to kind of where you want the lines to be. So what should be inside and outside of risk appetite. And that's down to your organization to kind of figure out what works best for you. And you can try and test and iterate as you go through. But hopefully that makes sense. What I've done here also, because obviously the bold risk appetite is this blue one, anything above that is an unacceptable level of risk. It doesn't matter what category you're in. If it's a very high score, 20 or 25, then that's too much risk, and you don't want to go there. So what you want to do is you want to bring your risks back below the line by applying mitigations, and obviously to lower the likelihood or the impact, then that would bring it further to the bottom left of this matrix. So, what is risk appetite used for? So, the first thing it's used for is for prioritization of your risks. So, risk appetite focuses the attention to the risks that make us feel the most uncomfortable. So, I'll use this small mini risk register example that I've put up here. So, we've got a project funding risk. We've seen it scored very high, and it's a project and it's got a bold risk appetite. So because it's a 4-4 and very high, it's within its risk appetite. So let me show you that on the chart here. So 4-4 and bold. So it's risk score 4-4, so 4 likelihood, 4 impact. Because it's bold, it's actually within risk appetite. Although it's a very high risk, you are still comfortable with that risk because it's below the line. So that's why our risk on this chart is inside of appetite. It doesn't mean you don't want to mitigate it any further, but when it comes to your risk appetite, you're fairly happy with where it is. The next one would be strategic direction risk. So this would be a 4-3 high, and because you have an open risk appetite, it would be inside. So let's have a quick look on the matrix. So an open risk appetite and a 4 and a 3. So a 4 and a 3 is below the open risk appetite, which is this green line here. So that one's inside of risk appetite. However, when it comes to our recruitment risk and our lawsuits risk, let's do the recruitment one first. We've got a 3-4, but cautious. So let's have a look at that on the other chart. So 3-4 and cautious. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see that this one is high and it's 12, but it's above the line, which is cautious, which is the yellow one here. So that means that that risk is outside of appetite. So we are therefore uncomfortable with where this risk is scored in our organization. And the same thing goes for lawsuits, which is reverse. And obviously we've got this call center one, which is inside. So with the power of risk appetite, what this essentially does is it focuses our attention to the risks that we are most uncomfortable with, because traditionally with our risk registers, we would score them from highest to lowest. And we'd often have the conversations about the high ones and potentially forget about some of the ones in the middle because they'll probably run out of time. But we now know that these are the two risks that we really need to be focusing on because we are uncomfortable with where they're sitting. We're comfortable with very high project risks. We're comfortable with high strategy risks, but we are uncomfortable with high people risks because they're cautious. We're uncomfortable with medium legal and regulatory risks, and obviously these are all examples. So we would know that these two yellow risks are the ones that we need to be speaking about the most. They need the most attention to bring them back in within risk appetite. And the second part is monitoring. So it's easier to keep an eye on the stubborn risks that we can't reduce and bring them within appetite. So it's got a dual purpose here. that the prioritization is one of the main factors. It highlights where you really need to focus your time, attention, and resources. So, what are the benefits of risk appetite? So, there are many benefits that you've probably thought of already, but I'll go through some of the more pertinent ones that I think apply to risk appetite. So it aligns with your strategy. So it ensures that organizations risk taking aligns with its strategic objectives. So when you set your risk appetite levels, you're aligning that to your risk appetite. So you're an organization that wants to take more risk when it comes to projects or less risk. Are you an organization that wants to take more risk with its people or less risk? You can align that with your strategy. It informs your decision making and your conversations. So, as I showed you in that risk register before, we used the risk appetite to help inform us which risks actually are we most uncomfortable with, despite the scoring system which is used, and how this helps obviously for us to manage our uncertainties a lot better. It helps us to allocate our resources more efficiently and effectively to the ones that we are most uncomfortable with. So we know that those two risks that I showed you before, that's where we need to be focusing our time and attention, not the ones at the very top, because actually it might be wasted resources because we're comfortable with those risks being at the top. A risk aware culture. So employees understand the level of risk that is acceptable, which encourages responsible risk taking and enhances accountability. So when you set risk appetite, you set almost a framework or a benchmark or a boundary that people know they can go up to that point, and we are comfortable with taking that level of risk. So whoever sets the risk appetite, whether it's the board or the audit and risk committee or your senior leadership team, you know that you're setting boundaries across your organization for different types of risks. And let's say, take reputation, for example. If you don't really want to be risking your reputation, it's helpful to set these boundaries to kind of highlight areas of risk that potentially are uncomfortable for you, and you need to have those conversations. It enhances your risk management generally, enhances your communication between different teams. Regulatory compliance, you can make sure that you really focus your attention on the areas, particularly in your industry, where you need to be compliant. It builds resilience because you know the areas where you are uncomfortable and you need to basically focus and maintain in the areas that you need to focus on the most, that potentially could be the most at risk. It's good for stress testing, because different risk appetites allow organizations to conduct scenario planning and stress testing tailored to specific risk, and this prepares them for potential adverse events and helps assess the impacts of various risk scenarios. And another one here, the last one here, is performance management. So, setting your risk appetite serves as a benchmark for measuring performance against risks taken. It allows organizations to evaluate outcomes against their risk tolerance, informing future decisions and strategies. So, you know which risks are inside and outside of appetite. And with a quick filter or a report, you know which areas of risk across your organization have the most risks that are outside of appetite. So you might see that one team has all their risks within appetite. That's absolutely fine. They're managing them well. Whereas a different team have loads of risks outside of appetite. So you can use that as a good way to kind of as an acid test to see which teams are performing the best when it comes to their risk management. And that is going to help build resilience in your organization. So I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions on risk appetite, please feel free to leave them in the comments, or also feel free to send me a direct message and I'll be happy to answer them. But other than that, please make sure you like and you share and you comment on this video, and just generally thank you very much for watching.